Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We would like to begin this event with a land acknowledgement. Lewis and Clark College occupies space in the historical homelands of several indigenous tribes. We want to take a moment to name the indigenous peoples who have been here and continue to be connected to the land that we reside in. We honor the indigenous peoples on whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand: the Multnomah, the Cathlamet, the Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watalala bands of the Chinook, and the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. Today, their descendants are primarily members of the Grand Ronde and Siletz Confederated Tribes, with Chinook and other tribal relations at Warm Springs, Yakima, and the Chinook Nation. Multnomah is unceded land, and therefore remains occupied space. In addition to the federally recognized tribes located primarily in the so-called state of Oregon and city of Portland, we acknowledge the presence of numerous unrecognized tribes and indigenous groups whose stories also demand and deserve our attention. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices and deaths forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, their deaths, and their descendants. We must also honor those today who continue to defend the land, educate us, connect us, and recognizing our institution, named for colonizers, is on stolen land is only the first step toward justice.
Thank you for coming to tonight's keynote presentation for the 22nd Annual Symposium on Race and Ethnic Studies, Sowing Resistance. This year, Ray Warren Symposium on Race and Ethnic Studies, Sowing Resistance, invite us to reflect on what it means to resist oppression, not only through protest, but also through presence, through care, connection, and everyday act of solidarity. It reminds us that resistance grows through community and that there is no liberation without care. My name is Gabby.
I'm Elizabeth Takusin.
And we are two of the four co-chairs of the symposium, along with two other co-chairs, Aileen and Dini. We are overjoyed to present to you a keynote presentation by Scot Nakagawa, the Anti-Authoritarian Playbook.
Before we continue, please turn off or silence your phone. For more information about the symposium, we invite you to check out our website for the full symposium schedule and details about the remaining events. We encourage you to share this information with friends and to anyone you think may be interested in attending an event. Tonight's keynote presentation is being recorded, and the video will be posted to the symposium webpage in the coming weeks. As you listen tonight, we encourage you to jot down notes, ideas, questions, as there will be time for Q&A after the presentation. Audience members will be invited to raise their hands and wait for one of the co-chairs to come to you with the microphone. We may not have time to get to all of your questions, but we will get to as many as possible. Following the Q&A, we will have a reception in the lobby where you will be invited to mingle and ask Mr. Nakagawa any questions we did not get to during the Q&A.
With that being said, we are honored to welcome Scot Nakagawa as one of our keynote speakers. He is a longtime racial justice advocate, a strategist, and writer whose work has shaped national conversations around equity, democracy, and social change. With over 3 decades of experience in community organizing and involvement building, he has been leading a voice in addressing issues of racial inequality, LGBTQ+ rights, and the rise of authoritarianism in the United States. Nakagawa's insightful analysis and commitment to justice have inspired countless activists and organizations to pursue transformative change rooted in compassion and solidarity.
He is actively working to bolster democracy and stand against authoritarianism. He co-founded and directs the 22nd Century Initiative, 22CI, which focuses on fighting against authoritarian movements while promoting inclusive democratic governance. Mr. Nakagawa also writes for the Anti-Authoritarian Playbook, for which this keynote is named, on Substack, where he shares strategies for resisting and staying resilient in challenging times. Additionally, he co-hosts the Anti-Authoritarian podcast, where he engages in insightful discussions with leaders and strategists who advocate for democracy. Please help us welcome Scot Nakagawa.
I know this is a silly question, but can you hear me in the back? If you can, yes, good. I appreciate that. I have a very small voice since I often need to, shout, so I don't like shouting. So first of all, I want to thank you for welcoming me back to Lewis and Clark College. I actually was a student here in the mid-'80s. I only attended for a short time, but my time at Lewis and Clark College actually changed my life. I'd grown up in a really small town on the island of Oahu in the state of Hawaii. It was a sugar plantation, still active sugar plantation at the time. It was one of those places where the high school yearbook each year included a page right at the very end from the plantation boss welcoming us to work in field and factory. And so you can imagine my world was pretty small. I worked for a few years as a service provider and then came here to Lewis and Clark, and what I learned here actually made a really big difference to everything that came afterward. Because what I learned was about theory and about how to turn theory into strategy and how to translate strategy into tactics, both in classes and through the student anti-apartheid movement that was then very active here. So again, thank you. And I just, I feel such great gratitude to this institution for having exposed me to so many new ideas, opening up my world, this little kid who grew up on a plantation, to, being able to embrace the kind of global context for politics that we are in. So that was my way of introducing myself. By the way, you don't have to call me Mr. Nakagawa. I am Scott. My gender pronouns are he, him. I'm just one of you, right? So the great civil and human rights activist Grace Lee Boggs would often open meetings by asking people, what time is it on the clock of the world? I want to try to address that question here. What time is it? As per our relationship with authoritarianism, what time is it on the clock of democracy? Are we at 11:59 at a very, very late hour, seconds before midnight? Or are we already in the dark fighting to see dawn? I want to answer that question today, but I also want to show you something else. Despite the frightening speed with which the Trump administration is driving us to autocracy, we can still beat them and win. And what's more, throughout history, when authoritarians have seized power, it has often been students, young people your age approximately, who recognized what time it was and turned the tide. So, let's start with what time it is. The hour here is very, very late. We are living through what may be the most dangerous convergence in human history. According to the Varieties of Democracy Institute, a democracy watchdog group, authoritarians now govern more than 70% of the world's population. Freedom House, another democracy watchdog, reports that only 20% of the people of the world live in countries they rate as free. In the last 16 years, we have witnessed the fastest decline in global democracy since both these organizations began tracking. From Hungary to Hong Kong, from India to the United States, democratic institutions are crumbling at an unprecedented speed. 21st century authoritarians are not taking over via coups as they did in the 20th century, but are instead exploiting the vulnerabilities built into democracy and are taking over via elections. Generally, these autocrats establish electoral autocracies, places where elections are still held, but they are highly manipulated to give the authoritarians a very strong advantage. But over time, the global pattern indicates that many of these electoral autocracies will evolve into direct dictatorships. In Hungary, for example, Viktor Orban was elected democratically in a clean election. He then systematically dismantled judicial independence, captured the media, rewrote election laws, and turned Hungary into what he calls an illiberal democracy. Translation, elected autocracy, a state where elections are held but rigged. In India, the world's largest democracy, their President Modi and his BJP party have persecuted Muslims, collapsed press freedom, ended the autonomy of Kashmir, and turning their secular democracy into Hindu nationalist authoritarianism. In Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro attacked the Amazon, indigenous peoples, LGBTQ rights, and Black Brazilians while consolidating executive power and attacking and weakening democratic institutions. The pattern is repeated in Turkey, the Philippines, Poland, Tanzania, Sri Lanka, and now here at home, where the Trump administration is weaponizing federal law enforcement to attack perceived enemies, building an anti-immigration army to execute mass deportations, shredding what is left of our social safety net, systematically hollowing out democratic institutions, and taking steps to corrupt elections. As to whether or not the US is still a democracy, my answer is no. Social scientists studying the rise of authoritarianism tell us there are 3 phases of authoritarian takeovers. First, there's a preparatory phase, which we are well past now here in the United States. The second phase is breakthrough, which is what the Trump administration and their authoritarian coalition experienced in the 2024 elections. The third phase is consolidation of authoritarian power. We are in this third phase now and are now more accurately a mixed authoritarian state or an electoral autocracy than a true liberal democracy. So that's where we are. Social scientists also tell us that once authoritarians experience a breakthrough, societies have about a year to 18 months to prevent full consolidation of authoritarian power. Well, a year of that time has already elapsed, right? Take heart, though, and remember that that's a historical pattern and not a rule. We may have more time, but we might also have less. So what's important for us to note is that the time is very short. But all the while this is happening, there's a second crisis unfolding simultaneously that we should be paying attention to. One that receives far less attention, but maybe even more destabilizing. Across every major faith tradition, we're seeing the rise of what scholars call cosmic warriors. Religious radicals who believe they're fighting ultimate battles between good and evil. They're engaging in these battles because they believe they have a divine mandate to do so, and that divine mandate actually extends to the use of violence in order to achieve their goals. Ultra-nationalist movements are rising within every major faith tradition. Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, and Buddhism are all powerfully affected. In fact, what I think we're witnessing is something along the lines of the Protestant Reformation happening across all of the major axial religions. And if you know anything about the Protestant Reformation, you know that that struggle was a long one and did descend often into violence. Nationalism as an ideology justifies that kind of violence, whether it's civic or ethnic. It considers violence legitimate when it is wielded in the defense of national sovereignty. So, for instance, here, white nationalism is founded on the idea that European culture and values, as they've been distorted and presented in the context of supremacism, is the foundation of the nation, and this foundation, they say, is under attack. Religious nationalism takes this one step further and legitimates anti-democratic action and even political violence on the basis of divine mandate. These two crises, the rejection of democracy and the rise of cosmic warriors, are feeding each other. Globalization and technological revolution have shattered the foundations of both secular authority and traditional faith. Governments can't control global markets or information flows. Religious institutions can't maintain moral authority in the face of scientific knowledge and cultural change. When both your government and your God seem powerless, people tend to reach for more radical versions of each. And we're seeing this happen all over the world. The result, as faith in democracy weakens, people turn to authoritarian strongmen. As traditional religion feels inadequate, believers embrace radical authoritarian ideologies. As both fail to deliver on their promises, conspiracy theories and cults flourish, each failure reinforcing the others. And here's what this means. Simply trying to restore trust in existing democratic institutions won't be enough to turn the tide. We must protect our democratic institutions and freedoms as the infrastructure we need in order to continue to advocate for democracy as we wish it to be. But we must recognize that the ship of traditional democracy is taking on water faster than we can bail it out. The ocean of change, technological, economic, cultural, and spiritual, will eventually sink us unless we do more than repair. We must transform, and that, of course, will be a very heavy lift, one that will require us to recognize that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to take action in spite of it. But then there's more. Here's what the numbers don't tell you. First, when mass civil resistance movements rise and act within the discipline of strategic nonviolence, we have slightly more than a 50% chance of defeating an authoritarian takeover. So we can actually win this fight. And in these efforts, in at least a dozen countries over the last 35 years, students were the ones who stopped or reversed authoritarian consolidation. Let me give you a few examples. First is the case of Serbia. Slobodan Milosevic ruled Yugoslavia and then Serbia for over a decade. He survived wars, NATO bombing, and international sanctions. He controlled the police, the military, and the media. The opposition parties were fractured and ineffective, and everyone assumed he was untouchable. Then students formed Otpor, meaning resistance. They didn't have money, they didn't have institutional power, and initially, they didn't have the support of Western governments. What they had was a fist symbol that became their brand, a strategy of nonviolent resistance, humor to make Milosevic look ridiculous rather than fearsome, and networks in every town and university across Syria. Using these assets, they spray painted their fist symbol everywhere, making resistance visible. They put Milosevic's face on a barrel and let people hit it with a stick for a dinar, using humor to crack the facade of invisibility or invincibility that Milosevic had built. They organized rock concerts that were really political rallies, and they trained in nonviolent discipline. When police beat them, they didn't fight back, making the regime look brutal and gaining the support of the public. When Milosevic tried to steal the election in September 2000, Otpor mobilized 500,000 people to Belgrade. Security forces refused to fire on the crowds, and the regime collapsed. Within days, Milosevic, who had seemed as permanent as gravity in Serbia, was gone. The students who organized Otpor were your age, approximately. Since then, they have created training materials that have been used by democracy movements in over 50 countries around the world. Then there's South Korea. After Park Geun-hye was assassinated, General Chun Do-hwan seized power through a military coup. For years, students led the resistance against that military dictatorship. They organized under martial law. They faced torture, imprisonment, and even death. In Gwangju in 1980, the military massacred hundreds of pro-democracy protesters, many of them students. But those students just kept organizing. In January 1987, police tortured a Seoul National University student named Park Jong-chul to death, then tried to cover it up. When the truth emerged, students erupted. The protests spread from campuses to churches to the streets. By June 1987, millions of ordinary South Koreans joined what students had started. The June Democracy Movement, as it was known, forced the military dictatorship to agree to direct presidential elections. And the military dictatorship fell, and South Korea became a democracy. And today, South Korea's global cultural influence and its economic dynamism, all of it traces back to students who refuse to accept authoritarianism. And then there's Indonesia. Suharto ruled Indonesia for 32 years. He controlled the military, the courts, the press, and the economy. He killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million suspected communists in 1965 through 66. He invaded East Timor, and he crushed every opposition movement. Everyone believed Suharto was untouchable, that he would rule until he died. And in fact, people waited. That was their timeline. One day he will die. But when the Asian financial crisis hit in 1997, students at universities across Indonesia began organizing. They occupied the parliament building. They created a moral crisis for the regime by refusing to back down even when soldiers shot at them. 4 students were killed at Scot University on May 12, 1998. Their deaths ignited nationwide protests. Within 2 weeks, Suharto resigned after 32 years in power. Again, the students who led that civil resistance movement there were just about the age you are here as students at Lewis and Clark. I could add many more examples like Chile, for example, where students led the resistance to Pinochet's dictatorship in the 1980s, and then in 2011 to 13, they organized the largest protests in Chilean history, eventually leading to significant constitutional reforms. In South Africa, students were central to the anti-apartheid struggle. The Soweto uprising of 1976, where students protested Afrikaans language requirements and were massacred, became a turning point in the anti-apartheid movement. In Greece, students in 1973 led the Athens Polytechnic uprising, occupying their university and leading to the eventual fall of the military junta. In the Sudan, in 2018, students were key to bringing down Omar al-Bashir after 30 years in power. And in Taiwan, in 2014, the student-led Sunflower Movement occupied the legislature for 24 days, stopping a trade deal with China and energizing Taiwan's democracy. In each of these instances, students didn't wait for someone else to save democracy. They understood what time it was, and they moved. The question is, though, if we are to move, how did we get to this place? Because understanding how we got to the place where our democracy is so threatened is really critical to understanding the nature of the struggle we must wage. The answer is in what connects all these authoritarian regimes that students fought: race, ethnicity, and gender. These are the avenues down which authoritarians around the world, and always here in the United States, drive their agendas. Milosevic in Serbia used ethnic nationalism, targeting Bosniaks, Croats, and Albanians. Suharto targeted ethnic Chinese and communists, killing hundreds of thousands. Orban targets Roma people and Muslim refugees. Modi targets Muslims and people consigned to lower castes. Bolsonaro targeted indigenous peoples and Black Brazilians. And Trump targets immigrants, Muslims, Black Americans, and trans people, which are demonized using race as a template. This isn't coincidental. It's strategy, one that is shared by authoritarians around the world who are learning from each other and growing more and more effective at playing this game. Authoritarians need enemies to justify power grabs. They say you're in danger, that foreign people are coming to this country and attacking you. We have to keep in mind that, over 170 million people in the world are displaced, live in refugee camps, or are stateless, or being driven to migrate around the world. As they arrive at the borders of countries that they seek out, where they're seeking out safe haven, they're being turned away by the millions, right? That tension is one that Trump and others are exploiting. It is the fastest way to basically get people to surrender rights, to activate existing fault lines of identity. So the student movements that defeated authoritarianism understood they had to address these divisions, not exploit them or simply avoid them. Otpor in Serbia brought together students across ethnic lines in a country torn by ethnic war and explicitly rejected ethnic nationalism. South Korean students built coalitions across regional divides that the dictatorship had exploited for decades. South African students in the anti-apartheid movement understood that defeating apartheid meant building a multiracial democracy, not just Black majority rule. Steve Biko's Black Consciousness movement empowered Black South Africans, while the broader student movement built multiracial solidarity. They understood you can't defeat an authoritarian who divides by becoming more divided yourselves. You defeat them by building the coalition they fear the most. So, back to what time it is here. We're not at midnight yet, but we can see it from here. I feel like I can see it from here. The warning signs are all present. Attacks on electoral integrity, judicial capture, media ecosystem collapse, normalization of political violence, scapegoating of vulnerable groups, and weakening of institutional checks on executive power. This is the pre-authoritarian pattern. Every single element is present. But we're not past the point where student movements made a difference in their own countries. Outpour started when Milosevic seemed invincible. South Korean students organized under martial law. Indonesian students moved when Suharto had ruled for 32 years, and Sudanese students organized under a dictator who'd been in power for 30 years. They didn't wait for perfect conditions. They simply created the conditions for victory and took action. To win, we need to understand that authoritarians succeed by exploiting the contradictions inherent in all incomplete democracies, particularly democracies built on racial, ethnic, and gender hierarchies. Democracy becomes most vulnerable where pluralism, equality, and inclusion were never fully realized. The cracks in the foundation become the avenues to authoritarian power. Student movements around the world have seen this very clearly. They didn't just fight to remove a dictator, they fought to build a democracy that actually included everyone. South African students in 1976 weren't just protesting the Afrikaans language requirement, they were protesting an entire system of racial exclusion. When police opened fire on students in Soweto on June 16, 1976, killing dozens, some as young as 12, it became a turning point because it exposed the inherent violence of apartheid. Those students understood you can't have real democracy with racial caste systems. Chilean students in 2011 weren't just protesting education costs. They were protesting an entire neoliberal system that made education a commodity. They understood you can't have democracy when education, the foundation of informed citizenship, is only for the rich. Their movement eventually led to constitutional reform and the rejection of Pinochet's constitution. When democracy includes some but excludes others, promises equality but delivers hierarchy, grants political rights but withholds economic power, and achieves formal freedom but maintains structural oppression, then authoritarians can exploit those gaps. So here's how we got here. Democracy was never complete because it was built on racial, ethnic, and gender exclusion here in the US. We need to understand that white supremacy and patriarchy were the original political forms created to justify and protect our economic system, which was rooted in slavery. The Constitution proclaimed formal equality, but only for white landed men. That bourgeois democracy was far from complete and created a situation of permanent vulnerability to authoritarianism. Identity hierarchies fractured solidarity. The Cold War both stabilized democracies around the world and justified anti-democratic repression. When the Cold War ended, what we failed to see, but that the right wing actually saw very clearly, was that as that repression was lifted, cultural fault lines could be turned into political battle lines. And so they launched culture wars. They attacked us on abortion rights, on LGBTQ inclusion, on issues such as affirmative action, et cetera, right? They put us in a position where we had to defend those peoples who were being attacked. We needed to redeem them, to refute these arguments. And all the while, they were waging a class war that undermined the foundation of liberal democracy, not just in the United States, but in the world. So these are all things that we need to really take into account. We also need to understand that neoliberalism destroyed working class security without accountability. In fact, what neoliberalism did was insulate large corporations and financial markets from democratic decision-making. Now a faction of capitalists in the world are lining up behind authoritarians because they believe that the ultimate way to insulate their wealth and power is to destroy democracy itself. Authoritarians exploit the gap between what democracy promised and what it delivered. The student movements that succeeded understood all of this. They didn't just fight authoritarianism. They fought for a more complete democracy. So, let me show you what this looks like in practice. In Hong Kong, the Umbrella Movement, students occupied central Hong Kong for 79 days. What's remarkable is what they built during that occupation. They created study areas with makeshift classrooms. They organized supply chains for food, water, and medical services. They developed decision-making processes using deliberative democracy. They built communication systems. They created art, music, and culture. And they practiced the democracy they wanted to see. They weren't just protesting, they were building alternative infrastructure that showed what democracy could look like. In Chile, students didn't just march. They occupied universities and ran them democratically. They created people's assemblies practicing direct democracy, built networks of mutual aid, created alternative media, and developed their own educational forums. They were prefigurative, building the world they wanted while fighting for it. In Sudan, after students helped bring down Bashir, they organized revolutionary committees in neighborhoods across Khartoum. These committees provided services the state wouldn't, mediated disputes, organized resistance, and practiced democratic governance at the local level. They built infrastructure while demanding it. In Taiwan, the Sunflower Movement led students to occupy the legislature for 24 days. They set up working groups on policy issues, organized transparent decision-making, practiced consensus-based democracy, built coalitions across traditional political divides, and, importantly, they live-streamed everything. There were over 500 phones taking pictures and recording what was going on and projecting it to the world. Many of those students are now in Taiwan's government, applying the democratic practices they learned during the occupation through an all-of-society effort there to secure democracy against constant attacks by China, an effort that is led by citizens and not soldiers. So let me give you some specific tactical lessons from movements that succeeded. From the Serbian Otpor movement, we learned that branding and humor can make a huge difference. The clenched fist of Otpor became instantly recognizable. Everywhere you looked, spray painted on walls, on stickers, on posters, you saw resistance. They used humor to undermine fear. When you laugh at a dictator, he becomes less scary. And keep in mind that fear is the ultimate weapon for those who want to be strongmen. The lesson for you is to create a visual identity for your movement. Make democracy defense visible on your campus, and use humor as a political martial art. From South Korean students, we learned the importance of sustained courage. Students organized for years under martial law. They faced torture, imprisonment, even death, but they kept going. They understood their struggle was a marathon, not a sprint. They built institutions like student unions and underground papers that outlasted individuals so that as new generations of students took the reins of the movement, they didn't have to start from scratch. So the lesson there, build for endurance. Create organizations with rotating leadership so losing one leader doesn't break the movement. Take care of each other. Burnout kills movements. And then from Indonesian students, we learn about strategic escalation. They didn't start by occupying parliament. They built through smaller actions, study groups discussing democracy, small protests that got bigger, coalitions across universities. Then, when the moment came, they were ready for occupation. The lesson for all of us is escalate strategically. Start with what you can sustain, build capacity, and then when the moment comes, and you'll know when that moment is upon you, you will, I'm telling you, definitely know when it's there. Be ready to scale up fast. From Chilean students, we learned about the necessity to build alternative infrastructure. They didn't just demand change, they demonstrated what change could look like. They ran occupied universities better than administrators did, and they showed that free education works. So our lesson here is build the world you want on campus now. Create co-ops, mutual aid networks, alternative media. Show people what you're fighting for. Here, I think what we need to do is build the nest, I'm told, right? So please, please invest in the nest. From Hong Kong students, we learned about transparency and technology. Everything they did was live streamed. Every decision was debated publicly, and they used technology to coordinate, but didn't over-depend on it because they knew it could be shut down. So the lesson here again, then, be radically transparent in your organizing. Use tech wisely, but have analog backup plans. Assume you're being surveilled, because you probably are, and organize accordingly. Be radically transparent all of the time. Make sure you have analog backup plans. Do all of these things and make sure that you're not overly dependent on the tech that oligarchs control and can take away, right? From Taiwanese students, we learned how to play the long game. The students who occupied the legislature in 2014 are now running for office, working in civil society, continuing the work. They understood the struggle doesn't end with one victory. The lesson here, some of you will continue as organizers, some will run for office, some will become lawyers, teachers, journalists, doctors who will bring these values to your professions. All of it matters. In order to protect and promote democracy, we need to politicize everything. That's a decades-long project, one that can take us through our lifetimes. And then from Sudanese students, we learned about intersectional coalition building. They brought together people across tribal lines, regional divisions, and class differences. They understood the dictator stays in power by dividing you, that your unity is his nightmare. The lesson is to build coalitions across identity groups on your campus. Yes, it's harder. I get that it's harder. I see what the fights are that are being waged. You will have conflicts. Do it anyway. Your coalition across race, class, gender, and nationality is what authoritarians fear the most. So, now I'm going to get even more practical and tell you 3 things you can do. First is organize on campus and develop democracy as a kind of an ongoing practice in that organizing. Perhaps host a What Time Is It forum examining threats to democracy here on campus and in the community that surrounds you. Form a democracy defense working group, open to all political perspectives that support democracy. Organize voter registration, but with a twist. Register voters and teach them how to protect election integrity. Create a rapid response network for when democratic norms are violated, and build coalitions with student groups you don't usually work with. Like Otpoor did. They started with small actions, putting stickers around campus, then bigger, organizing concerts, then massive, 500,000 people in the streets. They built capacity through action. So this week, one thing you can do to defend is to attend one event supporting democratic institutions, whether it's a voter rights rallies, press freedom event, judicial independence forum, or protest. Engage in constructive work. Start one alternative institution on campus, whether it be a study group, a mutual aid network, or a co-op. And go on the offense. Take one electoral action, from registering voters to volunteering for pro-democracy candidates and attending town halls. This semester, organize one major action on campus. Or I guess I should say next semester, right? Because aren't you headed for a fall break? Build one durable alternative institution. Support one electoral or policy campaign. And before graduation, master one organizing skill. Connect campus organizing to off-campus movements, and plan where you'll continue this work. In other words, get off campus. Meet the people who are organizing the protests. Take part. Become part of the planning. Learn from them, and then teach them what you know about the communities you're connected to so they can be mobilized. Before you leave today, exchange contact info with 5 people you don't know. Start building your network because you're going to need it. And in doing that, think about those 5 people or however many people you gather up as an affinity group, because you'll want them, right? You want to have affinity groups that support who you are, that recognize you whole and support you as such. People with whom you agree, so that they can provide you with protection and a context in which to have respite and celebration, and in order to be able to work with them on developing the ideas that reach other people just like you, and then connect those affinity groups to larger movements, so that you have pipelines to take mass action at critical moments when it's necessary. So, in addition to all of this, you want to be able to train people and yourselves, teach people the skills you're learning, and reach out to those training people to engage in nonviolent civil resistance. The Freedom Trainers, which is a group you can find at freedomtrainers.net, is one source of training in nonviolent civil resistance. Another is Harnessing Our Power to End Political Violence, which you can find at endpoliticalviolence.org. Harnessing Our Power to End Political Violence is teaching people how to make incidents of political violence backfire on perpetrators, raising the costs to them and making such acts less profitable. Let me be very clear. I know this is a lot to ask, but let me be very clear about what's at stake. Students in Myanmar right now are hiding from the military, organizing underground, risking death to keep democracy alive. Hundreds have been killed. Students in Hong Kong have been arrested under the national security law. Their leaders are in prison, and their democracy is being systematically dismantled. Students in Iran have been shot in the streets for protesting theocratic authoritarianism. This is what happens when democratic infrastructure collapses and students and others can't defend it. If democracy collapses here, your right to organize becomes illegal. This symposium can't happen. Your student groups become targets, your protests become crimes, your identities become weapons used against you. Your communities face intensified state violence, and your futures narrow dramatically. We still have democratic infrastructure to defend. Use it before you lose it. And as you do so, keep in mind that we know, all of us, that our democracy is far from perfect, but it still constitutes the kind of infrastructure that we need to fight again another day, right? We need to have our free speech rights and our right to protest protected in order to be able to continue to bring forward our grievances, organize people, mobilize them, and have an impact. So understand that, however imperfect it is, we need to use it, we need to exploit it. We need to be there too. And keep in mind as well that when we talk about democracy, as imperfect as it's been in the United States, we have to remember that democracy, democratic societies around the world, are places where people live longer and healthier lives, where infant mortality rates are much lower, where quality of life is much higher, especially for minority groups, such as those that have been excluded from democracy in the United States. So, what time is it on the clock of democracy? It's late. It's later than we want it to be. We're in the window where democracies either collapse or survive. But it's not midnight yet. And history shows us this is exactly when students and others can move. Think about what we've seen and what I've talked about. In Serbia, students toppled the dictator everyone said was untouchable. In South Korea, students brought down a military dictatorship backed by a superpower. In Indonesia, students ended 32 years of authoritarian rule. In Chile, students forced constitutional reform against neoliberal order. In Hong Kong, students showed the world what democracy looks like. In Taiwan, students stopped an authoritarian trade deal and energized democracy. In Taiwan today, there is an all-of-society effort to defend Taiwanese democracy against China. They are constantly under threat. But if you go to Taiwan, especially if you go to Taipei, you will see that there are protests happening everywhere. They're often joyful protests. When they are attacked by China with disinformation, there is a crowdsourcing kind of way in which they actually expose that disinformation. And they make the truth go viral. And they do so with the assistance of the government because they have brought the government to discipline under the democracy movements that they've built. So These are things that we should be really thinking about. Every single one of these movements was told they couldn't win, and every single one won anyway. Not because they had more resources, not because they had better odds, and not because they faced less danger. It's because they understood what time it was, and they moved. The ancestors of our movements faced this choice. They chose defense plus transformation. They chose to be both guardians and revolutionaries. Because of their strategic thinking, you have organizations to belong to, rights to exercise, and power to build. Now the choice is yours. Future generations will ask, did the students of 2025 choose strategic thinking over ideological purity? Did they defend democracy while transforming it? Did they build coalitions across divides, create alternative infrastructure, take the long view? Did they practice the democracy they wanted to see? Did they understand that democracy as infrastructure was not a compromise of their values, but the application of their values to this historical moment? Did they choose to be heroes when history called? The answer is in your hands. Serbian students were approximately your age. South Koreans were as well. The same was true of Indonesian students, Chilean students, Hong Kong students, Taiwanese students, Sudanese students, all approximately in your age group, all approximately demographically similar to you. They didn't wait for someone to save them. They didn't wait for perfect conditions. They didn't wait at all. They moved. And because they moved, millions of people live in democracy instead of dictatorship. This is what they've accomplished. So this now is your moment. This is your choice, your call. The tactics are proven, the strategy is clear, and the examples are all around you. Serbian students showed you how to use humor and branding. South Korean students showed you how to sustain courage. Indonesian students showed you how to escalate strategically. Chilean students showed you how to build alternatives. Hong Kong students showed you how to practice democracy, and Taiwanese students showed you how to play the long game, while Sudanese students showed you how to build coalitions. You have everything you need. You have history to learn from, you have each other to organize with, you have democratic infrastructure to defend while you build something better. So the work, though, in order for all of that to mean something, the work needs to begin now. Democracy must be understood as infrastructure, but justice it must be understood as the destination. We have to view coalitions as necessities, or transformation becomes an impossibility. The future is watching, the ancestors are counting on you, the communities you serve are depending on you. Students around the world, in Myanmar, in Hong Kong, in Iran, in Russia, in places where organizing is now illegal, are watching to see if students in the United States will defend democracy while we still can. So what time is it? It's time to organize. It's time to build. It's time to fight. And it's time to win. So let's go. Thank you. Thank you. So my understanding is we're going to have some questions. Is that right?
Yeah, we'll open it up now to Q&A. Scott will be calling on people, and then he'll indicate when we have the last question. So we'll end around 8:30 today. So
Right here in the front.
Okay. Hi, Scott. I was wondering, I think, given the current moment that this talk is happening and whatnot, like, my question is going to focus more on the US than any of the really neat examples you've brought up. That looking kind of in the last couple months, we've seen a big rise of like the No Kings protests. Mm-hmm. But how would you like to see these protest movements like change and emerge based on the research you've done, the examples you've given? Like what key like tactical differences would you like to see from how these protests have been happening versus how you think they could better be applied to protect and like improve democracy?
Mm-hmm. Well, so the No Kings protests, just, to put it in context, mobilize as many as 2% of all people in the United States to take to the streets in the first big protest, right? Globally, people who do this research to see what makes civil resistance movements effective say that it takes about 3.5% of the people to be in a mass mobilization, a sustained mass mobilization, in order to topple a dictator, right? That number is not a silver bullet. It's a historical thing. It's like a historical pattern. It's not a rule, and it's not a promise. But what it really speaks to is that it doesn't take that many people. So what the No Kings people are doing is really critically important. Same with Indivisible, same with all the big mobilizer organizations, the Women's March. They are moving thousands and thousands of people into the streets to take action. The actions that people are taking now, though, need to be considered really carefully, right? So the protests that we've seen, I consider defense, right? They're slowing things down. They're pushing back a bit, right? They got Elon Musk, for example, to step back a bit. But they are really just defense. What we need to do in order to be able to win is to pivot from defense to offense. So defense is protest. Defense is calling out the ills, calling out the problems, and naming the people who are committing these kinds of atrocities against us. Offense is non-cooperation, right? It's non-compliance. It's disruption. So things like strikes, boycotts, those are the kinds of things that eventually end up working for civil resistance movements around the world. It demonstrates something really simple that we should all know, which is that the oligarchs in charge, right, include a number of people who are simply kleptocrats. They're part of the authoritarian coalition because they want money. They want control. So if you can dry that up, many will fall out. For example, in the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos, the dictator, was forced out of power when he stole an election from Corazon Aquino. The Aquino supporters formed the People Power movement and actually went up against him. And one of the ways they were able to push him out of power was by organizing a run on the state-owned bank, which dried up all of the liquidity for the wealthy oligarchs who are part of Marcos's coalition, and that coalition split in half. And that created the opening for Ronald Reagan to demand that he step aside and come to my home state of Hawaii. But that is in fact what was a key to making that happen, was strikes and boycotts and a run on the state-owned bank. So think about that for a moment, right? These are all totally legal actions to be taking. You can decide not to go to work, right? You can decide not to buy a certain product, and you can certainly decide to withdraw your money from the bank. So these are the kinds of things that we need to step up to. We need to keep in mind that if only administrators, only people within our liberal institutions and our government act to try to stop an authoritarian takeover, the likelihood of success is somewhere between 7 and 8%. If a mass, strategically nonviolent civil resistance movement comes together, and keep in mind that strategic nonviolence part is really important, right? Nonviolent movements are more than twice as effective as movements that deploy violence at toppling dictators, right? Because the exercise of nonviolence helps to demonstrate the brutality of the regime. So strategic nonviolent movements come together and work with those people who are working within our institutions. Our odds of success go up above 50%, right around to 51%. The real lesson here, though, is that organized labor commits and goes all in to try to topple the dictator. The odds can go up to around 80% because they can't run their companies without us, right? Our consumerism, our consumer habits, is something like 66 or 67% of the flow in our economy. If we change those patterns, we can have huge impact. So think about, for example, the threat of mass deportations. We think of it as as something that will victimize immigrants, and we should. and we should think about how to defend them and prevent that victimization. But we also have to keep in mind that there will be other victims as well. Restaurants, for example, use immigrant labor. The financial model supporting restaurants just doesn't work without immigrant labor. The same is true of the construction trades. Growers, farmers, truck drivers, food processing plants, grocers, and then ultimately us, people who go to the grocery store to buy groceries, who will start to find that there are fewer things available to us, fewer choices, and higher prices. All of those people are affected, and so we have to think broadly about how to mobilize them and narrate them from multiple perspectives, right? So that's what I kind of want from them. At this point, the No Kings rallies have not had an absorption strategy, which, in other words, they didn't have a way of figuring out who was in those protests in order to be able to mobilize them to take additional steps. But they're now developing one, and that's a really important thing. So when you show up at those places, I know people are afraid of signing onto petitions or to lists in order to be able to stay engaged. Keeping your name off those lists is not going to keep you safe, right? The best safety lies in millions of people putting their names on those lists. Because at that point, when millions have committed, we become ungovernable, right? There are no jails to put us in. There's no deportation system that can deport us all. So be courageous and take your protest public. Anyone else have a question? There.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk this evening. I appreciate you being here. I'm wondering, I have a question, but before I ask it, I want to clarify the research that you were referencing regarding nonviolent resistance. Does it consider the destruction of property as nonviolent or violent?
It doesn't consider destruction of property as violence, but in the context that we're in here in Portland, Oregon, where the strong man in charge is saying that we're at war and there are multiple fires and things being destroyed, we need to think of demonstrations as political theater. We need to show people that, in fact, that's just nothing like the truth, right? So peaceful protest is what we want. And, we also have to keep in mind that while, whether it takes 3.5% or 5% or 6% of the public being in mass mobilization mode in order to topple a dictator, it takes millions more supporting those people who would never join a protest in order for that to really be effective. And so we're performing for them too, right? We're showing them what freedom looks like. We're helping them to see that we can work together peacefully through means that they can relate to in order to be able to achieve the victories we want to score. So no, property damage is not considered violence. It might be at some point a necessary part of our struggle, but the moment for that is not now, right? What we want right now is the frog and the other inflatables and the ice angels and the naked bike ride and the Portland Marathon going right by ice while cameras are on them, that demonstrate that, in fact, Portland is not at war with itself. There's no security camera footage outside of any federal building that can demonstrate that there have been fires and protests there. There's nothing of the kind. Local police say it's not happening. State police say it's not happening. They're saying they don't need the help of the National Guard or of a big ICE deployment. But that's not what the public is hearing from the Trump administration. And so we need to demonstrate to them that, in fact, Portland is not that place.
I hear what you're saying. Do you have any concern that focus on the optics of the perfect peaceful protester as a site on which the state can demonstrate its violence creates a permission structure for blaming victims of state violence on their own behavior rather than on the state?
Are you saying does violent behavior create a justification?
I'm saying, does focusing on the optics of the protesters create a situation in which anybody who deviates from that is assigned blame for their own victimization by the state?
Well, some people are just going to deviate. You know, it's always been true. I've been an activist for almost 50 years, like since the 70s. And in every kind of protest movement I've ever been part of, there's always a small faction of people who basically, within the context of the large protest, when they have an audience, will start to, you know, behave in ways that perhaps are not what the protest organizers would have wished for. The state must maintain a monopoly on legitimate violence in order to rule, right? It cannot sustain challenges or allow challengers to go unpunished. So any kind of violent action is going to cause the state to act out violently in return, right? When the state does not act, it is a tacit endorsement of those acts. And so, for example, Trump's pardon of all of those Jan 6 insurrectionists, that's a tacit endorsement of the violence they brought in that day, right? It legitimates it, at least at the level of the federal government. And so, you know, you just have to keep these dynamics in mind. What we don't want is for repression to come down the middle, right? For them to be able to make the argument, there are these extreme elements on either side, neither one of which can maintain nonviolent discipline, and so we need to squash protests altogether, in which case our right to protest is endangered, right? And right now, there's a big gap between local law enforcement here in Oregon and ICE and the national, and Trump's, kind of federal deployment. There's a big gap. People feel disrespected. They feel like they've reported on this and they're not being heard. We need to actually work within that gap, right? We need to make that gap bigger. We need to try to drive defections from people in local law enforcement and get them to start to support people who are involved in peaceful protest, right? To actually protect protest movements when they see them peacefully, marching and then being violently attacked.
Hello. Thank you once again for your talk. So you put a lot of emphasis on the peaceful protest part. And I think my question would be, at some point, there's always going to be at some point when the peaceful protest starts and there's a little bit of frustrations and just negative feelings, if this is not happening as fast as we want it to be, or the violence that's being enacted towards the protesters as well. Is there any direct solutions that you would suggest if a peaceful protest were to suddenly become a little violent as a result of all of these frustrations and negativity? Because there are instances where a peaceful protest, if people are put under enough violence by soldiers or army or the opposition, they will retaliate in fear of themselves or in fear of others. Do you have any direct solutions or suggestions on ways to direct this immediately if it were to happen at a protest that we are attending?
Well, I think that people should, have the right to self-defense, first of all. I just want to make that really clear. People get to defend themselves. And what you do in private is none of my business, right? It's what we do when we publicly are representing the resistance movement that is what matters. And so, I would say, protect yourself, get trained in nonviolent civil resistance, learn the tactics, including tactics to keep yourself as safe as possible. And also, though, keep in mind that when the Birmingham campaign during the civil rights year was underway, remember Bull Connor turning those fire hoses and dogs on those children? That wasn't a surprise. They specifically chose that jurisdiction and specifically mobilized children, knowing that would happen. They knew it. They baited Bull Connor into taking those actions. Because when he did, it demonstrated to the world, this is what Jim Crow really looks like. You think it's just segregated water fountains? Oh, no, no, no. How is that segregation enforced? This is how it's enforced. Is that the kind of government you want to live under, right? And the majority of the American people said no. So important also to keep in mind in the context of the civil rights years, early on in the movement, the majority of Americans, something around 60%, thought that the civil rights weren't being achieved fast enough, and were pushing the federal government to go faster and faster. As soon as the urban uprisings began in the wake of the assassination of Dr. King, those numbers collapsed, right? I'm not saying that the anger and the frustration that people demonstrated wasn't legitimate. But what is legitimate is not always constructive, right? And so we need to stay on the side of what is constructive, what tactically, strategically is going to help us to build our movement, to attract as many people as possible so that we can become so many we become ungovernable, and think about what we can do around that.
I guess my quick follow-up would be, what's the word for it? Strategies in de-escalating the situation if fellow protesters were to rise to the taunts, and how to de-escalate that rage that suddenly builds within fellow protesters to ensure that it remains peaceful throughout.
So in my experience, when people start to act out in that way, there's not much you can do about it, right? There have always, in all the years that I've been involved in this issue, been a small faction of people who are opposed to authoritarians, who also are attracted to political violence. It's part of the reason why they want to get engaged, right? When in the early years of the neo-Nazi surge here in Oregon, like in the 80s, when I was organizing around that issue, there were always those people who really wanted to be in the mix. They really wanted to get into the fight. And I don't think there's much you can do to argue against it, right? They're operating according to a theory that I think is obsolete and kind of out of context, but that's no time to have that conversation. And so I would simply isolate them, step aside, because trying to stop it is likely to escalate things even further. The one thing I did see Portlanders do, though, which I thought was really good, was while people were protesting at the ICE office, a group of people here, Protect Oregon, deployed angels, people actually dressed in angel costumes, with water and, I don't know, cookies or something. They had refreshments. And they went there and started passing them out to the protesters, and that had the effect of making people calm down, right? Because they were being taunted, they were being baited. It caused things to kind of calm down. It was funny, and it also gave people the sense that they were being cared for, and it just kind of changed the mood. So things like that can make a really big difference. Keep in mind that humor is a really powerful tool, and deploy it whenever you can. Oh, right here. There's one here and one there, so whichever way you want to go.
Thank you so much for speaking tonight. My question is, how do we stop government and state changes, or when there's like a governmental and state transition of power into becoming more authoritarian in this vacuum of power that is left after those transition periods? Or another way of putting it is how do we effectively rebuild?
Well, the 22nd Century Initiative, we deploy something we call block and build, right? So it's a two-part strategy. One is to block the mainstreaming of authoritarianism, and so we do that in all the ways, But then there's also a build strategy. And that build strategy has to do with building alternative institutions and networks where democracy can be practiced in real time by people. We support people developing distributed organizing networks, right? So hubs connected to networks of people who are not necessarily formally related to the hub itself, A good example of that is here in Oregon, there's something called the Rural Organizing Project. The Rural Organizing Project was founded in 1993, right after the state of Oregon was fought a ballot measure 9, against that was an attempt to change the Oregon Constitution to have LGBTQ people named abnormal, wrong, unnatural, and perverse, and to be excluded from any possibility of civil rights protection. Right? We defeated that measure. And, but one of the things that happened in the course of that campaign was that a bunch of rural groups came forward and wanted to participate. They weren't going to get campaign support, right? Because the traditional logic of a campaign is that you fund activities where there's the densest number of voters in a statewide race like that. And so because voter density in Wheeler County is so low, they weren't likely to get many resources, maybe just some lawn signs. So the Rural Organizing Project basically went around and thought, we need to develop a network. And what they did was they went to battered women's shelters in all of the rural counties in the state and got them to open themselves up as sites of organizing. They understood that those folks knew, right, what it was like to organize in violent contexts. So they started there, and they formed these little human dignity groups. Most of those groups still exist in Oregon and still function. The Rural Organizing Project still exists, but the Rural Organizing Project's just the hub. Most of those little groups are not funded. People are not paid to do that work. They're voluntary organizations. They get resources and support from the hub, but they're not directly connected to them. So, you know, that's kind of mode that we're pushing people into. And so I would strongly encourage thinking about things in that way. You know, like how can you create networks? And keep in mind, when you create a network, with every node you add, the distributive power of every other node grows larger, right? And that's something that we need. You know, we're getting a lot of message advice right now from all kinds of people who are pollsters and researchers and whatnot, and the advice is really good. The problem is that the organizations that are receiving those messages don't have the distributive power to get them out far enough to have real impact, right? And so what we're trying to do here is to increase the distributive power of those organizations by taking unlikely allies and more likely, you know, people who are more likely to step up at first to defend democracy together, and getting them communicating and getting them moving message so that we can start to actually be more effective and get those things across. I don't want us to miss that there was someone right here who had their hand up. Yeah.
So something that I've noticed, if you look at like the 2020 protests, for example, is that there were these wonderful networks of like resources and support, but a lot of them kind of fell apart as time goes on. So how would you recommend that we increase like durability in protest structures and in like resource networks?
Well, you know, there are really good resources out there. You should be checking out the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict. It is led by one of the people who led the Otpor movement, and I mean, they have incredible organizing resources and stories to tell that are really useful. There's the Horizons Project. The Horizons Project is staffed and, you know, led by people who have been in international peacekeeping and have been, you know, advisors to movements around the world that have faced authoritarianism. And so they have a lot of really good strategies to share. One of the things that they're telling us to do is to move up pillars of support strategy. What the theory is that authoritarians, in order to be able to rule, require certain pillars of support, right? Faith, the military, big business, et cetera. And so they're saying target those pillars, identify people within them who might defect, and start to drive defections from them. For example, deploy veterans in order to be able to try to make the argument that the Army should not be visiting places like, you know, or invading places like Los Angeles or Portland. So they're all out there. And then there's freedomtrainers.net, which I referenced earlier. They do great training. They're really fun. It would be a fun thing to have them here on campus if you can, because they'll send a team that will teach people nonviolent civil resistance strategies about how to not comply, about how to disrupt, right? So there are those resources, as you said, but burnout's still a problem. You know, it's a difficult thing to daily get up and face this thing and have to do it again and again and again. So I would advise people to do what I said earlier, which is form affinity groups, right? Where you can actually support one another at the local level, and then attach those affinity groups to other affinity groups, and then attach all of them to the big mobilizers, so that when the call comes to take action, that you can. I would also choose a goal to make things more concrete. So one of the things that we're trying to do now is to mobilize people toward the midterm elections. What we're doing is using a curriculum that was developed by people in the Utpoor movement who are now in the United States, called Hold the Line, and using it in order to be able to engage people by the thousands and thousands, you know, hopefully by the end of this, by the millions, in a kind of set of strategies to make sure that every vote gets counted and that we have as clean an election as possible. And on the way toward doing that, we're identifying what are the capacities and infrastructures that need to be in place if the election's stolen, so that we can actually move so many people to take action, and action of the right kinds, that make us ungovernable by the authoritarian and force a crisis on their side where they have to react in a way that the public can, that exposes their agenda to the public. So I would just say that, you know, I've been, like I said, doing this for almost 50 years. I'm beyond burned out at this point, right? I forgot what burnout feels like. But, you know, what's exciting to me about this time is that it is in fact the case that democracy as we knew it in the 20th century is no longer viable in the 21st century because of all the changes I talked about, right? And so it's not just, you know, I want a more radical future that guides me to say that we should not be trying to go backward, right? It's a necessity to go forward. So we need to start to frame what we're doing as a fight for the future, right? And that's why, in particular, I think students can play a really powerful role. I'm 64 years old. Most of my career in life is behind me. The future that we're fighting for is not one I will live in, right? But it's one that you will live in. That's your inheritance. And so, you know, I would say, you know, really think about that too. You know, that we need young people in this movement. We don't have enough of them in the movement now, right? I'm not trying to complain. I know that lots of people have heard the thing about how the No Kings rallies and whatnot attract nothing but old white people. I love those old white people. I've talked to many of them, and you know, they understand really clearly that what they're doing is putting themselves out in the public, protesting, knowing that if the cops descend on them, they will gain the sympathy of the public because they're like people in their 60s and 70s who look very mainstream and in fact are. Lots and lots of them live in Beaverton, right? And they understand that they're distributing risk. They understand that certain groups have been terribly targeted, like immigrants, for example, like black people, like other people of color, like trans people. They know that that targeting is happening, and they're trying to distribute the risk and get some of that directed at them, right? Because they are harder targets to attack. So, you know, we need young voices, but, you know, we should celebrate the old folks who are actually standing up for us and putting their bodies on the line. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I'm not sure I have exactly the answer you're looking for.
Okay. Hi, thank you. Thank you for your talk. So I'm an international student here at Lewis and Clark, and I see very, very few international students in this room right now, and there is a reason for that. So my question would be, in the end of your speech, you said something really important, that is, people in this country still have the right to protest. We don't have the right to protest. We were clearly said by this institution and the media in general that if we go downtown right now to protest, there is high chances that we're gonna get deported and be expelled from this democratic space we live in. So then my question would be, when considering protests, collaboration in protests between ethnicities, races, nationalities, how can we actually promote this cooperation if a very significant portion of this group is completely denied the right to protest and even speak up in class sometimes?
Well, the same is true of undocumented immigrants who are migrant workers in the United States, right? They're not turning out because they understand the vulnerability that they're in, that they could be arrested and deported. And that's a totally legitimate thing. But there is more to do than simply hitting the streets with signs and yelling at, powerful people, right? There is much more that needs to happen. We also need to build alternative institutions. We need to build mutual aid networks. Many people who are in immigrant communities in Oregon are doing just that. That's their contribution. They're developing sanctuary, they're developing networks underground so that they can keep their people safe, which could be used by any of us if the time came that we would need them, right? And they're building mutual aid networks to ensure that their people get the things they need, even if they can't be in public. And so I would just say, ask yourself the question, what can I do that doesn't involve putting myself in that position? And I'll tell you a little story. So my parents, and especially my grandparents particularly, in the 1940s were involved in the first successful agricultural worker strike in the United States, in Hawaii. Right, at the time, Hawaii was a territory, and immigrant workers there from Japan, Korea, China, and the Philippines were largely excluded from politics. My grandparents were disenfranchised. They could not vote. There was no direct way for them to actually wield power in the political system. But World War II happened, and when World War II happened, the Masters and Servants Act, which was the act through which the plantation owners were importing labor from Asia, closed down. So they could no longer import new labor, so there was no replacement labor for the people in the fields. Japanese Americans weren't interned because the plantation bosses wouldn't have it because they needed the workers. And so they saw in a moment for themselves and recognized they could reach for power, and they went on strike. They joined with the ILWU, and they held a strike that went on for quite a long time, that eventually brought what was then in Hawaii a white supremacist, modeled after Jim Crow oligarchy to its knees, right? But it wasn't just because people showed up on the picket line, right, in spite of men on horseback with whips riding around. It was because people like my grandmother formed mutual aid networks. They formed also dance clubs and community safety patrols, alternative banking systems to get people out of debt to the company's store so they couldn't be arrested for non-payment of their debts. They also created backyard gardening collectives. They did all of these different kinds of things that made it possible for the movement to sustain itself for as long as it needed to in order to win. Because once they went on strike, they got no money, and at that point, many of them were making 75 cents a day to begin with. So they were able to actually sustain that movement long enough through all of those other things. So ask yourself, what of those other things fits what you think you can do and what you can contribute, and do that instead. So oh, there you go.
Thank you for this wonderful talk this evening, class of 1974. My question is as I learn the structures of resistance today, you talk about affinity groups. I heard you mention that moves up to mobilizers. In terms of this structure, do you have a website, or is there a way I can learn more about this work you've been, it's been your career, but at the same time, my eyes are always looking to receive good information. Where do I learn a bit more about the nuts and bolts of organization, please?
Well, you can go to 22ci.org. We are in the process of compiling a 22ci.org. So it's 22nd Century Initiative. We are developing now a compendium from the Substack that I write. We're turning some of the articles into slide decks with discussion guides. And so we're breaking things down so that people can actually go ahead and use that and do their education themselves without having to rely on us, right? And we allow people to take full credit, right? You're the leader. You have to adapt the ideas to your local context, and so you don't need to give us credit for anything. You can just use what we have. I also strongly suggest freedomtrainers.net. It's a project of, what is their new name now? The Freedom Together Foundation, which is a very large foundation that used to be known as JPB Foundation. But the Freedom Together Foundation established that and is gathering resources from many places in order to turn it into a shared watering hole. And one of the things you can do there is that you can contact them to get trained. And I've trained with them, and the trainings are fun, and they're incredibly useful. I feel like I've learned a tremendous amount by going through the training because people tell you their stories, right? So you start to learn, like, I see you're doing this. I never even thought of that, you know? And so those contexts are really rich ones in which to learn. So I would go to those places and try to adopt what you can and adapt it to your particular, situation. So is there anyone else? Or have I tired you completely out?
Well, we will also have an opportunity in the lobby to ask questions, so I think we're going to cut it off right now. We have a couple closings as well. Thank you all for showing up. If we could give another round of applause to Scot Nakagawa for being here.
Thank you.
We want to quickly remind everyone that we have a full day of events tomorrow, including a presentation, dance workshop, fashion show, and the closing event of the symposium, race monologues.
Again, we're holding a reception outside where you can ask more questions to Scott, so please stay and join conversation. Do the task that he told you to do and find 5 people to connect with today, because we really want you to build coalition and mutual aid and community here. So thank you again.